Look, I know it's boring, the YouTube cheese. Hey, hit the like and subscribe button, but it actually matters. It's going to make a difference to what guests I can bring for you to give you the best alpha in the world. So just stop what you're doing for a second, hit the like, subscribe button, and then we'll get on with the interview.
Hi, Exponentialists. Hope you are all well. I am back on the platform. I think it's only been a matter of days. It's been 3 or 4 days since I last saw you, so I trust you're well. Now, look, as you can see from the title of this one, we are back for round 2 of a project I just love. It's 2035, an operating manual. And that is a series of conversations with my colleague and good friend, Tad Smith. Tad is the former CEO of Madison Square Garden, former CEO of Sotheby's. He's a partner at 10T Holdings. He's a big voice on crypto, Twitter or X. He's all kinds of things to all kinds of people. And we are going to have a second wonderful conversation in this session. Tad, it's so great that you're joining us again. How are you?
David, I'm terrific. And given that we're going to talk about work today, I should probably point out that 10T Holdings' name is changed to 50T Funds, and everything I say does not reflect their views. So the good hygiene checkbox.
That is noted. That is duly noted. And yeah, I knew that, right? I've heard this, but you told me that last time. 50T Funds is the new name. Now, look, as you say, we're going to do work in this session. So 2035, an operating manual, is this journey we've decided to go on into our shared future, into the collision of these incredible technologies. Of course, AI is perhaps the biggest, reshaping the future, what it all means for us, how we navigate it as investors, how we navigate it as professionals and human beings. And we're going to walk through a series of topics in this journey. And we've decided that this conversation is going to be all about a topic that is hugely on everyone's mind, which is the future of work in an age of intelligent machines. And there is so much to get into here. Just a little context before we just go at it. Everyone is, of course, asking, what does AI, what does intelligent machines mean for the future of work? For the meaning of work, for my career personally? These are huge questions. So far, any kind of slam dunk effect is like clearly absent. You know, if you look at white collar employment as a share of total employment in the United States today, it's stable. It hasn't really changed since the advent of ChatGPT. But there are early signs that is starting to shift, right? And I just want to look at 3 very quickly. If you look at a new benchmark OpenAI launched just last month called GDP Val, this is a benchmark that tests how good are AIs at frontier models now at doing economically useful tasks. So most benchmarks so far have been about fairly abstract intellectual problem solving. This is how good are AIs at doing economically useful tasks. And they've taken kind of real tasks drawn from real people's work days and asked AIs to do them. And look, to cut the story short, what you see is that frontier models are getting better quickly at doing economically useful knowledge work. They're getting better in a linear fashion, but it's a pretty steep line. They're getting better fast. What's more, if you look at some research done by probably the leading economist on all this, Eric Brynjolfsson, who studies the impacts of technology on employment, on productivity, he's kind of dug a layer deeper, and it gets really interesting because what he finds, again, to cut a long story short, his paper is called Canaries in the Coal Mine. And what he finds is that in domains that are particularly vulnerable to the kind of AI we have at the moment, so content creation, customer services, some others, hiring of entry-level positions is diminishing rapidly. In other words, a strong signal that corporations, organizations are, instead of hiring in like young grads and entry-level people, they're asking AI to do that work. Okay. And that's kind of, that's corroborated by some research done by a couple of Harvard postgrads. And I'll put all these links into the chat. And they've really dug into the data and found that companies that are embracing AI, the companies that say they're using AI, are hiring fewer entry-level positions. So, headline for me is, look, it's not happening yet full pelt, but the early signs are that it's starting to happen, and we're just at the beginning of something monumental. And we, from there, can just roll into it. And Tad, I have all kinds of, issues I want to get into with you. And I think I start with, you have this incredible background as a CEO, as a leader inside large corporations. What do you think corporations look like, given all this, like 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And how would you, as the CEO of Madison Square Garden, of a big corporation, be handling this moment if you were the man on the spot, kind of dealing with this now?
Yeah. Good questions, all. So a lot of how, let me do your first question first. I struggle to see how companies 5 and 10 years out have the same level of employment as they do today. And I suspect what we're going to be experiencing for quite a while is the paradox of GDP going up, productivity going up, and overall labor employment going down. And there are lots of ways to think about it, but one version circulating is that you look at companies with significantly high labor content, particularly now in the knowledge space, and you look at that and you say, your labor content is my margin of opportunity from a competitor. So, and that is going to be a significant transformation. We'll talk about the social effects of it in just a minute. But that's where I see 5 and 10 years out. 10 years out is a little harder to see, but 5 years out, I can't imagine that it's going to be anything where you have as much labor content as a percentage of the total revenue as you do now in almost any company. The second point I would say is, and you mentioned this, you called it content. I would call it both content and also software development, where you see it particularly depends on the type of company you're operating in. Right now, code is increasingly able to be done by agents, and the AI itself is beginning to do it. So where you'll see significant labor erosion, you're already seeing it in those areas. And I suspect it will move to more experienced jobs very rapidly. And that also, by the way, is in the link you're sending around. It's a very powerful view on it. So let me just pause there and say, everything else being equal, I see companies having fewer people working in them, and reasonably soon. Also, we should talk about, obviously we'll talk about a little bit later in the conversation, what effect that will have on wages and the total amount we spend on it too. Yeah. If I were a CEO today, again, it depends on which type of company I'm in, but I would be designating a top executive with AI responsibility in the company to figure out all the applications. There is a chance if I were a large company, I would be getting expert advice on it. There would be board committees that are either being assigned or potentially reviewing it. And there would be metrics and goals put around it, because almost any aspect of a large company's operations now is going to be influenced by AI. And I think the competitive intensity is now visible on the horizon. The one thing that I think I wouldn't be doing, or I wouldn't recommend anyone doing if I were CEO, is doing nothing.
For sure. That feels like the biggest risk right now would be to just try to ignore this. This Harvard study is really interesting, and it takes a cut of the companies that are trying to do something with AI and uses those that are doing nothing with it as a control group. And my first thought when I read that is like, who the hell's just sitting this out? Who's doing nothing with it?
Well, there are some. There are some. And by the way, remember that this one, unlike the internet to some extent was a precursor in the late 90s. But this one entails a huge amount of cognitive dissonance. And I think you're seeing that in the labor data. You yourself said that the labor data is putting a lot of pressure on entry-level work. But it's not necessarily putting much pressure, or at least measurable pressure, on mid-career and upper career individuals. And part of that, I would say, is in an era of uncertainty where we don't fully know the impact, and the models, although, quote, you need extensive experience to make sure that what they can do is ready to be deployed. There's not a lot of upside, to be frank, in corporate leadership replacing a lot of years and years and years of experience on the promise of AI. It's much, much easier decision to limit intake, limit hiring, and begin to apply it there. And also to move people around, particularly people that have more translatable skills within the company, and slow the spigot of hiring. Much, much easier. Yeah. And remember, these are CEOs, by the way, that are fresh from the pandemic, where they couldn't hire fast enough and they couldn't find the labor that they wanted. So they have a recency burn, if you will, from that experience. And then bang, they have this superpower technology that can replace significant tasks of their workers, what they do. That technology is evolving. So it's not perfect. And moreover, insofar as they don't have enough experience with it, they maybe tried it and they saw hallucination, or they read it in the New York Times last year or whatever. Unless they're immersed in it, they don't know how replicable it is to replace tasks of their existing people. So there will be friction, and there is.
For sure. Yeah. And it's really interesting that those dynamics are clearly how this is starting to play out. In other words, it's playing out first with limiting of entry level kind of hiring. And just in my own experience, that makes sense. I mean, the big organizations I have lots of dealings with, some, for example, Accenture, just, I'm very familiar with the kinds of work that goes on there, and the way AI can help, can most sort of meaningfully, concretely help that type of work right now is you can have mid and senior level staff saying, hey, like, I'm just going to use AI to give me a first draft of this report, of this PowerPoint deck, of this analysis, of this talk I'm going to deliver, whatever it is. And then I will edit it up into shape, right? So whereas once you had like an army of juniors doing that, now that's kind of, you can just get a really decent first draft. And then you need someone with the taste and experience and knowledge to kind of make that good enough. But that kind of okay first draft is what your junior used to do.
Yes.
So two interesting things come out of that, right? One is what are the key challenges for that in organizations? The obvious question around that is like, where does your talent pipeline go? Who becomes your senior people if you kind of kill hiring of junior people? And the perhaps even more kind of powerful, resonant question for most people is, what does this mean for young people starting to navigate, enter into? I feel like it must be terrifying to be graduating into this environment now.
Yes.
We're going to talk about education, so we'll get a lot into this, into kind of what should we tell the kids, basically, in our next conversation.
Yeah, and I teach.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, so
we'll talk about that too. I mean,
we'll get right into that. But like, how are your young people in your classes like experiencing this moment, and what do we think it's going to mean for them for their first decade of work?
So the first thing I would say is that anyone who thinks young knowledge workers are blind to the trend, or at least the noise around the trend, is simply not switched on. They're well aware of what's going on, and they, interestingly, you have two different sort of almost a separation, if you will, between those who are embracing it, diving deep into AI, learning how to use it, becoming incredibly facile with it, and viewing it as a life-changing tool and potentially helpful to their careers, and those who are doing things the way they were taught to do them without AI and resistant to it. And when I say resistant to it, they're just not in the habit of using it. And because they're not in the habit of using it, they are increasingly separated from those who understand what the power of it can be. And I'm talking still about the young cohort of folks. And that's deeply concerning. With respect to the notion about what happens, to your other point about the talent pipeline. Well, remember that the premise of your question, the talent pipeline, is that in the future, they'll need a talent pipeline.
So, a quick break in your regular programming. If you're serious about your future, grab my free report called Prepare for 2030. I think you've got 5 years to make as much money as possible, and this guide will help you navigate what's coming. The link is in the description. Download it now.
That does underpin my question. And I suppose I still feel intuitively that, like, you know, my kind of overarching take on this is, and in alignment with you, it's very hard to see how corporations don't lose a lot of junior and middle level kind of knowledge worker, like human staff. But I think certain kinds of corporations, partnerships, might start losing senior ones too, because they see the handwriting on the wall and they start wanting to position themselves in new slots where they still can. Right. Yeah. Yeah. But the organization will still, I suspect, for some time to come, want or need some form of like very senior human representation out onto the world. For some time to come, I think that's true. And by the way, there are some aspects of that could be quite a long time. Yeah. Meaning ambassadorial roles, curation roles, public face roles, sales or problem solution, the human aspect of that roles, all of those roles will be tremendously valuable. Leadership roles. Exactly. By the way, not to mention AI deployment and strategy roles. Right. Exactly. And I guess, you know, in terms of that division that you talk about is really interesting between the young people who are willing to kind of embrace these AI tools and those who are just sort of resistant to that or just less willing to engage. And I think in terms of actionable takeaways for people listening, that feels to me such a clear divide, you know, and as we stand on the eve of this entirely new work environment, I think one of the big dividing lines is going to be between people who are able to engage in this stuff and use it and supercharge themselves through it and become more effective operators because of it, and people who resist. And it's going to be very, very hard for people who resist. So in terms of navigating this work environment, like point number one for me is, you know, start using these tools, start finding the ways these tools make you better at whatever it is you're bringing. 100%. Everyone should be trying them, embracing them. By the way, and not uncritically using them, to be sure. Let's be clear on that. But critically using them. That is to say, thinking about the best that they can offer and where they fall short, supplementing them with that human element and a good, smart eye and judgment and all those other things. The last thing you want to do is submit a legal brief that you haven't read, that AI cooked up. I mean, and to use one interesting example from the news this year, those are things that are just no-nos. But everyone would benefit from understanding what they do, understanding their power, becoming more facile with them. There's just all upside, no downside in it. And I have further questions about sort of what your what you're telling the young people in your class about, and other, other young people, kind of the children of friends, people like that. Before I get to that, like, here's a counter thought, and it's one we've discussed before. This idea that tasks are not the same as jobs. And AI is great at like eating specific tasks, okay?
Yes.
But it's rarely able to eat enough tasks and the exact right combination of tasks to eat an entire job.
Yes.
And a great example of this, one we've discussed, is like, is by now I think you can call it a classic example, is the MRI scan. Like, AIs have been great at reading MRI scans for quite a while now. They're better than human beings at reading MRI scans for quite a few years, I think it's fair to say. But we have more MRI medical professionals than ever before. We're still hiring them. And that's because, like, being that medical professional is, yes, about reading the MRI, but it's also about a range of associated other things, like communicating with the other doctors, communicating with the patient, just being a human being in that process in all kinds of ways. And AI can't do those things. What if that is what if we're overblowing this and that's actually the way this is going to play out, and we're not going to see a huge impact on employment? We're just going to see everyone using AI.
Well, I respectfully disagree with a part of that, which is I think the area where we could be dead wrong is in one of 2 points, which is that the AI models suddenly hit the wall, or number 2, the paradox, which we'll talk about later, about as new technologies come, they create jobs that you don't anticipate. With respect to the MRI situation, I don't think that's a good example for us to hang our hat on. And the reason is because MRIs are part of the medical profession, which is very heavily regulated, requires licensure, and certainly in countries like ours, has a lot of legal liability related to it. And in that instance, you need a human in the loop who has a license in order to execute the task. The fact that significant portions of the task are hollowed out, and also the fact that that license is controlled tightly, by the way, both by the states and also by, frankly, the medical profession, you can imagine it will be highly resistant to replacing workers for quite a while. The closer, I would think generally, is the closer you get to government licensure, government protection, regulated entities, things like that, the more resistant you're going to get to broad transformations in the replacement of labor. That said, going one level deeper, we should not rest on our laurels with the idea that only 10% of my job can be done better by AI, or 15% of my job, because in a capitalist system where there's tremendous pressure on returns and lots and lots of creative destruction, using a Schumpeter's term, what you find is that people very quickly reconfigure the entire pool of tasks so that it can be more efficient with fewer people. That's the rub. So I don't think there's a place to hide there.
Instinctively, I feel that's right. Like, short term, I think some of the effect I'm talking about will play out. Medium and certainly longer term.
Short term.
Like, yeah, exactly. The bundles of tasks will be rearranged such that humans can be knocked out. Again, by the way, with the licensed version, let's go back to MRIs for a minute. Soon, I predict, there will be someone who does not use AI and gets the wrong answer when AI could have gotten the right answer on an MRI scan. And then that will set an interesting court precedent, and that will set a new notion. And by the way, that could potentially transform things very rapidly. We implicitly assume AI produces a worse result than the human being, and therefore we want a human being in the loop. The value of the human being in the loop in that medical example that you gave is that person has the license and that person's legally responsible for the diagnosis, and is also authorized by the state because they have a certain level of qualifications and they've reached a number of hurdles to provide the diagnosis, rather than, say, ChatGPT's scan. But
don't think for a minute that a clever plaintiff's attorney won't find an opportunity to say, well, wait, whether that person is designated or not, the person had to use AI because they had a duty to the patient to do so, and they didn't.
Right, exactly. And that's where I think this is going to play out in all kinds of sort of lumpy and unexpected ways, because there will be some jobs where the bundle of tasks really is 90% replaceable by AI pretty quickly, and that job just goes. There'll be other jobs where that's much more awkward and difficult, and then there's regulation involved, there's legal liabilities involved. There's some people's job is basically going to end up being to be the person who's legally responsible for the decisions taken by AI.
Yes.
And
by the way, as you apply AI to a human-centered analog enterprise or even a human-centered digital enterprise, what you're going to find is that there are new tasks. How do I intermediate between the human being and the AI? How do I put AI in the loop? We'll create all sorts of tasks and complexities that will also create opportunities for human beings.
Yeah, and that actually pretty naturally takes us on to this second counter thought, which is a kind of Jevons paradox counter thought. So people have talked about this in relation to kind of compute, an NVIDIA, this idea that actually making compute more efficient could be great for NVIDIA, because when you make it more efficient, paradoxically, you sort of increase the demand for it greatly, and people end up using even more of it. That offsets the kind of cost decline, and NVIDIA ends up making even more money, basically. What if you see something comparable here, and AI makes human labor radically more efficient, lowers the costs of services that humans provide, so greatly increases the demand for those services, because human beings are just insatiable. And it feels like we're sort of in late stage capitalism, and it feels like all we do is buy things from one another. But perhaps we're just scraping the surface of that, and there's so much more we can do for each other and buy for one another. And so actually, paradoxically, you end up with more demand for human labor than you did before, especially given that managing these AIs and these tools and all the rest of it will create new kinds of jobs that we don't even know about yet. How do we feel about that? That feels to me a more persuasive, longer term pushback to this idea that AI just devastates, work for humans, or the job market for humans. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there are two things I would observe. The first one is, can we imagine that as the technology rolls out, there are periods of time where human beings can more flexibly and quickly take certain things on than machines? One, we just talked about how you integrate AI into a company to make it more efficient. That's hard for a machine to do. That's a much easier task for a human to do. And that's a new task, as it were. But I don't think at the speed that these things are evolving and developing, we should expect those tasks to remain like that for very long. Because again, the premise of the question, in order for that to be sustainable, that human beings will have tasks that they can do better, the presumption is that the machines are not evolving very rapidly. And we haven't even gotten to recursive creation, meaning where the machines are improving the machines to do tasks. So yes, it's possible that we'll experience a period of what I would call AI friction, in which human beings are rapidly redeployed to new areas and things, such as this imaginary job of bring AI into a human enterprise and make it work better, which undoubtedly is already happening. That's a new job. But I am cautious on the idea that it will be sustained very long. The second thing, and this is more sobering, if that weren't sobering, and I don't mean to be too sobering today on a Monday, but we need to think about the effect of that on wages and compensation. Because as the demand for labor grows slack, wages will become lower and lower and lower, and more depressed, because you'll have more human beings that are enthusiastically embracing things to do. So there'll be a lot of social consequences and political consequences and economic consequences of that, even if you're right.
Yeah, yeah. And it feels like the conversation now can enter kind of a new chapter, or this book, starts part 2, because we've established the big picture. We've laid out some challenges to the idea that AI is going to lead to radically diminished need for human labor. And we're not persuaded by those challenges. So does this amount to saying, I open part 2 with the thought, does this amount to saying a huge human problem is approaching that is going to play out very painfully in the lives of, tens of millions of people? The economy, the world of work, the importance of labor is about to be radically transformed in ways that are very difficult to understand, very difficult to imagine what society looks like after this shift, and are very painful for lots and lots of people because they won't have a job, and the people that do have a job, wages will be severely depressed, as you say. Is that how I know you don't want to be too doom and gloom, especially on a Monday, but it kind of sounds as though we can't avoid that is where we see this heading.
Well, keep in mind that we also see cancer being cured. We see wealth being created at a substantial rate. We see human productivity beginning to soar. We see people that are living, having vastly more opportunity to live at higher standards of living. We see things like distressed governments able to provide for their social programs as wealth is created. We see substantial debt repayment in in a lot of the Western countries that are struggling right now to make ends meet. We see advances in science that are at the moment unthinkable. We see much greater human efficiency and on things like energy and the deployment of the grid. We see that whole thing being fixed. We see better situation with those who are concerned about the climate. We see abundance. And the challenge and the opportunity for us is that we need to manage both at the same time. And so I think we can have a sort of dystopian take on it, or you can have, and I don't want to say utopian take, but I can say we're going to get both. And how we manage it is important. In this particular conversation, I think we can think about those as possible scenarios of the future, and maybe they're both scenarios for the future. Maybe they are at the same time or at different points in time, and how to think about careers and work with those competing notions in our brains.
Yeah. And I mean, I love that. And there's a huge amount to dive into there, because it feels like, exactly. I would align with all of that too. Like, look at when people step to me with a bleak vision of what AI can mean, I tend to say, but look at the other side, just as you did.
But by the way, you can't actually just have the bleak. The point is, the bleak alone doesn't happen. If the promise of the so-called utopian things I just laid out isn't on the table, nobody's going to invest for it. Nobody's going to replace human beings for it in their labor pool. That's the point. That's what's so fascinating about it. Meaning, it is the very results of AI and the promise of results that makes for the economic engine to deploy AI, deploy the capital related to AI instead of labor.
Yeah. So exactly, if it's going to be so powerful that it will wreak this devastation on the job market, it's also going to be so powerful that it will do these amazing things.
The only way that makes sense, right?
That's the only way that makes sense. Exactly.
The only way that $50 trillion worth of labor spending gets replaced, or even in part gets replaced, is if there are trillions more of value and opportunity and wealth and abundance being created, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense.
So then I want to get your view on there feels like two big strands to this. How does that play out in the life of the individual, and how do they navigate that kind of landscape that we are envisioning? And then also, what do we need to do together as a society to tilt this towards the, less dystopian, sort of reaching for a more utopian kind of vision? I mean, let's start with how the individual navigates this, and how lots of people out there listening to this will navigate this. Like and I've said this before so many times on the platform, my kind of baseline vision for individuals is that corporations are going to employ far fewer people. Organizations of all kinds will employ far fewer people. Much more work, kind of short to medium term, will shift towards independent, like freelance, solopreneur forms of work. And then the nature of that work will shift too. And it will become much more about community and feelings and counsel and forms of creativity. And you'll get many, many more people essentially making a living and delivering value on the basis of small communities of people around them who love some aspect of what they do and love it in a way that you can't love that from a machine. They love this particular person. They love, their background, their taste, their perspective. And they just want that from that human being specifically. Does that feel, that can feel somewhat unrealistic or hard to imagine to some people? What do you make of that?
Well, I think the first thing is what we said several minutes ago, which is everyone at all stages in their career should be experimenting with, becoming familiar with, embracing these new tools, and figuring out how the tools, A, are accelerating, and B, how they could change personal lives for the better. So that's crucial. And by the way, that happens in all aspects of whatever phase in the career you're in. I'm not sure how the end game plays out, what the structure of that sort of labor economy looks like. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Give me a couple more minutes to reflect on what you said. But one thing I can say is that in this environment, I think taking a 20th or early 21st century notion to careerism is unwise. Go to school, get a very pre-professional oriented degree, get the best possible, highest paying job afterward, often a knowledge worker job, potentially go to professional school or go to graduate school of some sort and get the sort of most pre-professional qualification you can get. Most people would go into some sort of business that had a long runway of pre-professional, potential high income gains. What you have to do is put this new lens that we're putting on it and say, not only are people likely to live a lot longer, meaning their working years are going to be much, much longer with the promise of AI and longevity. Their careers are going to be much longer. But their careers are going to be very different from the ones that started when I started out. They're going to look very differently. I mean, I went to college, I worked hard, then went to business school, came out, started working for a consulting firm, also worked for a bank on Wall Street, and then did a series of jobs in large companies. That traditional approach to getting ahead is going to be suspect in this new economy. And the faster we encourage everyone to take a view on the point you made a couple of minutes ago about what does it mean, I think the better. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about this when we get to education. But clearly, one of the things that I would be saying is part of your career will be defined by how financially flexible you are. And I know, this is part of a Real Vision conversation. This is definitely not financial advice, but Real Vision is very oriented toward helping everybody get to a financial footing. And so I think getting that as quickly as possible, giving yourself financial flexibility, that gives you flexibility in how you choose to live and grow and professionally develop. However, in addition, let's just take back to Utopia for a minute. In a world where you don't have to grind, to cover costs. In a world where you have abundance all around you, that frees you up to experiment, to try, to do new things, to adjust, to decide what is the work, or what is the contribution, or what is the thing that you want to do. And so I would encourage everybody to see that is a tremendous opportunity that honestly human beings really haven't had a lot of experience with in the last many thousands and thousands of years. So that's very exciting to me.
Yeah, and that fundamentally is how I see this, or is a way I think this can play out if we can seize it. And this is the deeply optimistic sort of strain in my thinking, is exactly as you say, if we can create an economy essentially of automated abundance where AI agents and humanoid robots and all the rest of it just produce abundance on autopilot, that can liberate us into a world where we are free to focus on the things that only human beings can do.
And want to do.
And want to do. Right, exactly.
The key is want to do.
The things
it's not like the economy is sort of
from one another.
Exactly. Today we have, you can listen to podcasts all day and hear about successful people talking about things. Well, do what you want to do. But the truth of the matter is, most of the time we have significant constraints. I believe we will have, if this transition is managed well, few constraints on what we want to do. Now, what that'll do is impose on us a responsibility to choose what we want to do and to pursue it. And that will require energy. We can't just be inert. But careers will be in ways that we can define, not by having to make the rent each month and the constraints of financial issues. And frankly, that's a real positive, because at the moment, that's really kind of what we have. We have lots and lots of people grinding it out each day in jobs, many of which they find to be miserable, so that they can pay for the kids, make ends meet, do those things. And I believe that AI offers the possibility, as long as it's managed well socially and culturally and politically, to free us from that to do other kinds of things that we want to do.
Yeah, I think that is the absolutely huge prize in sight if we can get this right. And again, I've said so many times before, all over on stages, everywhere on this platform, we've gone on this long journey through modernity with machines that is in some sense coming to a kind of conclusion now, to a sort of end stage moment. The machines are going to be so capable that we can essentially hand the economy over to them. We can liberate ourselves from what we call the economy now and come back to a focus on the things we want to do, the things that are still there when abundance takes care of itself. And there's all kinds of things that are still there when material abundance is happening for you, and knowledge abundance.
Back to the Jevons paradox you made it. It's not only all kinds of things are still there, they're kinds of things that will be there. Example, maybe it's possible to start colonizing space. Now, that sounds crazy right now, right? Until you have AI acceleration. And of course, there will be folks that say, well, the truth of the matter is robots will do it first. We understand that. But imagine all the different kinds of possibilities that to us seem completely nuts right now in a period of abundance and acceleration and intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I love that. And I think that's it sounds way out there, but I think it actually
sounds way out there only because we have an experience of the past. We do not have the experience of parabolic acceleration of intelligence, which is what's happening.
Exactly.
And so we can be Cassandra, and that's not a good place to be. Or we can look into the future and say, there are things that are more than dreamt of in our philosophy that are actually going to be knocking on the doorstep. And again, the key point here is you can't have this dystopian labor replacement without the promise of the rewards from it. Those two are absolutely linked. They can't. The one is a necessary condition for the other.
Yeah, and I want to get into that in more detail in a second. But here's a second example that's very different that sounds way out there in a totally different way, but I think can become realistic, which is just, instead of being a kind of middle ranking accountant now or lawyer in a firm, okay, AI agents are going to be able to do that knowledge work, that task, that job is going to be kind of slightly rebundled and obliterated. I see lots of those people, for example, like being in their neighborhoods, gathering around them 20 people of kind of, sensibility and fellow feeling. We have a loneliness crisis. We have a care crisis. We're very atomized as human beings right now. Just gathering a community of 20 people around them and just communing and just sharing the experience of being human day in, day out, just being with one another, and value exchange will proceed on there'll be an economy of that. Now that kind of can sound insane and a very thin basis for like a job, but I think that's just because we're stuck in this mindset of we have to grind the cogs that create abundance. We have to grind the cogs that make the economy go round. When we're liberated from that, there'll be all kinds of things we can do for one another. And the machines can't do that for us. The machines can't sit in front of another person and say, I truly understand you. I see you as a fellow human being. I know how it feels to be you. This is how we feel living in the neighborhood at the moment. You need that kind of fellow feeling from a human being. And I think that's where a lot of value exchange goes. Sam Altman has said jobs will get sillier and sillier. And I think that there's something profound in that. It sounds a somewhat trite statement. I think there's something profound in it. I think a lot of jobs will go to the very top of the kind of human need food chain around happiness and status and meaning and fellowship. We'll do a lot of that, but we'll also, as you say, we'll go cosmic, we'll go to space, we'll, build incredible robots, we'll discover science that we didn't have time to discover before, all the rest of that stuff too. So to me, that's how this can play out if we can seize those opportunities. But, and you hinted at this just a second ago, the second big strand here is, like we've talked about how it plays out in the lives of individuals. If we're going to realize that vision, isn't there a need for some form of, and I'm going to use a word now, redistribution of the abundance created on autopilot by the machines? Do we need to go UBI? Do we need some form of, sharing of the abundance? Or does it not get rather dark if the abundance is all hoovered up by the people who happened to own the AI and robots when this thing started?
So let me set universal basic income aside for just 1 minute. I want to respond to one other point you made. I think it's important to see that the notion of, and the very word itself of job, is inherently related to 20th century and late 19th century and maybe even earlier thinking. Right? Because a job is a task or set of tasks that you do in order, generally speaking, because you are required to, either you're getting compensated for it or you're required to it for some other reason. But one of the things that abundance promises is that the very concept of job, and you said it, the community image that you gave, I would emphasize purpose. What you're going to be doing is choosing more purpose and things that you want to do toward your purpose rather than jobs. Now let's turn to universal basic income. This is a flashpoint and obviously a hot button. But I think it's important to see that I'll just use the United States, and we could use many, many countries as an example. In the United States, we already have social safety nets. We have Social Security. We have Medicare, we have Medicaid, we have a range of programs for people that fundamentally need a little extra help, or sometimes a lot of extra help. Collectively, we could name that anything we wanted to, right? We choose not to, but we could, and we choose not to, presumably for lots of good reasons. Enhancing those, adjusting those, altering those, improving those, making those better. We could, for example, we already have subsidies built into things like owning a home, when you get a mortgage. There's so many aspects where the government is already providing certain kinds of subsidies or help for individuals. Collectively, as the government begins to pay off debt from abundance, we could adjust those upward very significantly without ever getting to the hot button letters UBI. We could simply dial them up, drop the age for Medicare substantially, improve the access to Medicaid, make it much more generous, significantly improve Social Security with abundance. At the moment, we're talking about, oh my gosh, in 5 or 10 years, we're going to run out of it. We might actually need to make the retirement age higher, all these other things. In abundance, all of those things reverse and the flywheel becomes positive. We can do more here, we can do more there, we can do more here, we can do more there. Now, traditionally, there's been a point of view that the more of those things you do, the less a person wants to, quote, work. And I think that is an interesting thing that we should take up in a downstream conversation. What does human purpose become in the world of AI? I think that'll be really robust area to talk about. But it's important to see that without adopting a broad view on the letters UBI, we don't need to do more than simply tune up and make more generous many of the things that in this country are already going on. And by the way, I'm not talking about 5 and 10% adjustments. With the kind of promise of wealth creation that AI offers, we're talking about huge improvements. And interestingly, you don't even, of course, we could always adjust the tax code. So you use the word redistribution. I would just use the word distribution of increasingly significant rewards could go on at a very great pace when the GDP starts hitting high single, low double digits, or frankly can't even be measurable because it's going so fast and productivity kicks up. Those are the kinds of things that are part and parcel of abundance. And again, they don't happen, meaning labor replacement doesn't happen without the promise of those rewards. Meaning the dystopia only works, for much as it works. It's a strange way to phrase it. I apologize. It only works with the promise of the rewards. And frankly, if the rewards don't show up, the negative aspects will stall out immediately or be delayed. Wait and see.
Yeah. And I think the way you outline that playing out is, in my view, how it will play out. I think, like UBI and terms associated with it have become so sort of politically contentious that it's, they're kind of useless now, and you don't really need to have an argument about UBI. I think this plays out by degrees through the adjustment of, state assistance and state intervention that already exists. And there are ways of thinking about this where that is much more clearly, well, you've outlined it beautifully, how it is a continuation of things that are already in train, right? Another great example of this is that when the state pension was first enacted in England, like I think it was like in the mid early 1800s, I think, it was the state pension age then was 70. The average life expectancy was like 50. So this state pension was, back then, in its inception, was if you live to be like exceptionally old, like you're almost certainly not going to get this old, but if you do, we'll give you kind of some form of annual assistance, right? And through an incredible increase of abundance and wealth across the 1800s and into the 20th century, that essentially became, if you work for a certain number of decades, then for the final 2 decades of your expected lifespan, like we really expect you to be able to enjoy this, we will give you like what amounts to a UBI. So you're going to work for a certain amount of time, and then you're going to be given a universal basic income for the final sort of 10, 15, 20, some cases 30 years of your life. And it just happened by degrees. Now that's become incredibly hard to afford. But imagine, and this is a nice place to kind of wind this up. Isn't it going to be wild when this happens? Like, imagine if we start to be able to lower the pension age rather than have a conversation about increasing it, because GDP growth is on fire. And
so where it's going to
is
happen, here's my
rocking.
prediction for what's going to happen in the next few years. We started the conversation on the, troubling effects on employment and wages that are going to come, and we're beginning to see little ripples around the edges. At some point in the next few years, those little ripples will become waves, and we'll begin to see the data clearly that economically, the labor is under pressure, and wages are under pressure, and the labor market's beginning to wane pretty quickly. At that moment, the first thing I predict that will happen is that the Fed will begin printing money to begin to accelerate the economy, since it's one of its two things. And by the way, it will also be significantly deflationary, that aspect, right? I mean, labor is a huge, huge portion of the cost structure of the economy. And so if there's any downward pressure on wages, so the first thing you will see is the Fed will begin printing money. The second thing you will see is that the politicians, who are highly sensitive to public opinion, will very quickly begin to extend employment benefits, make them more generous, substantially improve all the different kinds of things that we talked about. And it will happen very rapidly as soon as there is a moderate emerging consensus that labor is under pressure. So again, the dystopic transition is something, we like to fantasize with. We all saw Terminator as a kid, all that good stuff, or maybe you saw it as a kid, but many years after it was released, if you're young. But those things, we can sort of flagellate ourselves with those dark pictures, but in practice, we are likely to adapt in ways that are very quick when we need to, and sometimes not entirely intuitive. But wait and see. There's no scenario where the government sits around on its hands for 3 to 5 years and lets the labor market collapse and everybody get tossed from AI. It's not a scenario that makes any sense.
Yeah. So in that way, and by degrees, perhaps we move towards a happy place here.
Well, the point is, we're going to take the edge off. Happiness, I believe, is a choice. And by the way, as I said, we're going to get to that probably in the last session, right, when we talk about human purpose and the meaning of purpose in a world of AI. And just to tease that for just a minute, there is a scenario here where we all take a blue pill in the matrix rather than the red pill. And that to me is the biggest concern. When you don't have to work, what do you do? How do you choose purpose and mission? But we'll get there.
Yeah.
So is next time education, or what's up next? Education
is up next, exactly, because we've just outlined, absolutely monumental changes that we see coming to the nature, the structure of work, the structure of the economy. As much as we've said, look, it's likely that the edges are taken off this. It's likely that the kind of dystopian fantasy does not come true. These are still monumental changes, and they will be massive, difficult and wild to live through. And there's that kind of part of me that just cannot wait to see how this plays out. So, but yeah, next time, okay, given this vision we've just outlined, how do we educate our children? How do we prepare them for the economy that is coming? I think what you said about jobs is so true. Even the word job is founded in a set of assumptions that are fading out. How do we prepare them for that world? And you're an educator. You teach yourself, so you have a great perspective on this that I cannot wait to dive into. And then we're going to march all the way through to the ultimate kinds of questions, like you said, what is the meaning of a human life? What is our purpose in this incredibly new environment we're going to find ourselves in? And we're going to dive into those questions too. So Tad, look, another joyful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. I promise we won't wait so long until number 3. Number 3 will come in a matter of 2-3 weeks. We'll be back here on the platform.
Let's see if we can get it in before Thanksgiving and late November. How's that?
Exactly. Yeah. That is a promise. That is a promise. But for now, everyone, thank you for tuning in. Tad, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, David.
Next time.
So you obviously like this video enough that you've got to the end. That's quite a big task. But listen, do me a favor, hit the like and subscribe button, and also check out what video's next, because I think you'll love it. But if you want even more, and when I'm talking more, I'm talking about member-generated ideas, incredible alpha, research, everything there to help you in your journey, just head to realvision.com/join for the best financial intelligence out there and the pure alpha that's within the platform.